So the earliest texts that we have from India, from the Buddhist tradition, are committed to writing around the 1st century BCE. They represent ostensibly several centuries of oral tradition before that. And anybody who's studied Buddhism is going to know these things, these bullets I'm going to put up here. This is for the benefit of those of you who are less familiar with Buddhism. The first point to make is that Buddhism quite self-consciously sees itself and speaks of itself, that is to say, Buddhists speak of their tradition as a solution for human illness, or human sufferings of all kinds, of which there's sort of a common formulation of either 4 or 8 primary forms of human suffering, of which illness is always one. So Buddhism sets out from the beginning a notion that Buddhism has something to say about how to overcome the suffering of illness. In many cases, how Buddhists talk about overcoming the suffering of illness is through a sort of stoicism, a kind of reflection on the impermanence of the human body, an acceptance of the impermanence of human life, etc. And that certainly is a major strain, a major refrain that we see in Buddhist texts. However, medicine pops up everywhere within the Buddhist tradition. It's in all kinds of genres, and it appears in all kinds of different guises and forms, in addition to the sort of philosophical reflections on detachment that I just mentioned. So there are many, for example, narratives or similes or parables that involve illness, healing, some kind of medical care, nursing care, etc. I just wanted to draw your attention to this mosaic. This must be 3 stories high, mosaic in the entrance of a Buddhist hospital in Taiwan that I'll come back to at the end of my talk. But this is a depiction of a narrative in which the Buddha comes across a monk who's sick within the monastic complex. The monk hasn't been cared for by the other monks. The Buddha cares for him with his own hands and then sort of chastises the monks after the fact, saying that monks are required to care for one another, give each other medical and nursing care within the monastic community. There are many reflections on the healing benefits of various contemplative practices that are also found in these early Buddhist texts. It's not mindfulness, MBSR style, right? It's not, in many ways, it's not very consonant with the ways that we are studying and understanding the effects of meditation today in the modern period. But there are many texts that will discuss a patient who's sick, a monk, sometimes it's the Buddha himself, experiencing some kind of transformation of that illness, or relief from that illness, directly because of contemplative practices, contemplation of some aspect of the Dharma, or of some kind of quality of practice. The early Indian Buddhist texts happen to be the place where we first see in writing the Indian medical doctrines that are going to wind up in the Ayurvedic medical classics. So the kind of the written, the literary medical traditions, classical medicine of India, those texts aren't written until several centuries after the Pali Canon. So again, those texts are also based on oral history, an oral transmission beforehand, going back several centuries. It's very difficult to say which one came first, but in terms of being written down, the Pali is written down earlier. And in the Pali Canon, we have mentions of Indian medical doctrines, some very kind of foundational Indian medical doctrines, such as the 4 elements, the 3 doshas. I don't know if this means anything to anybody here. These are kind of basic principles of Indian medicine. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is the monastic disciplinary literature. So we have, both in Pali, but then also in Sanskrit and in Chinese translation, we have in existence a very large corpus of not only monastic disciplinary rules, but then a number of commentaries on those rules and interpretations of those rules as well. Those texts are filled with references not to medicine in the abstract or in the philosophical, but to actual medical practices. Each one of the main monastic disciplinary texts, the Vinyas, have a section that is dedicated to the rules that are relevant to the storage, the collection, the storage, and the usage of medicine. And in those Vinyas, the sort of the narrative frequently goes that, you know, such and such a monk was sick with whatever disease. The monks come to the Buddha and they say, he's sick, we need to give him X medicine, or we need to do X procedure. We need to find a doctor who can do X procedure. And the Buddha normally assents and says, yes, this is allowable, you can do this. So narratively, it's not very interesting, but in terms of the sheer number of diseases and remedies that are introduced in this way, it's actually the monastic disciplinary literature is actually a very important source for the history of medicine in India. Again, many of these texts predating anything like this from the Ayurvedic tradition. So I'm not a scholar of India, and a lot of what I've been talking about is based on the scholarship of other people, including people who have contributed to this book. My research really, in terms of looking at primary sources and going in depth into Buddhist ideas about medicine that are coming from the Chinese context. Don't put too much stock in these bubbles that are on my map here. This is meant to be sort of schematic, not accurate. But the point I want to make here, as I show you this map, is that India is very closely connected historically. Ancient India is very closely connected historically with the Greco-Roman world. We know this through various exchanges in art and science and literature and so forth. But it's very clear that the medical ideas that develop in India, Ayurvedic tradition, and also the medical concepts that we find in the Buddhist texts, that they have a close affinity, let's say, with Greco-Roman medicine. There's many cognate concepts, and this I'm meaning my map to show you that there is while there's an affinity between European and Indian medicine, there's a gap between those forms of medicine and Chinese medicine, which develops in a very different context and develops very different conceptual, metaphorical, and practical applications. So this is something we can talk about in the Q&A if we're interested in sort of a comparison of Indian and Chinese medicine. What I'm interested in for the moment is just pointing out the role that Buddhism plays in transporting some of these ideas and some of these practices from the Indo-European world across the Silk Road, around the maritime routes, into East Asia. And that's been the primary sort of area of research that I've been involved in up to this point myself in terms of primary sources and in-depth research. So my research has been looking at how these foreign medical concepts and models and metaphors, how they're dealt with in Chinese translation. So how Chinese translators choose to either find equivalent concepts in the Chinese indigenous language that can be used to gloss these foreign ideas, or how they might transliterate these Sanskrit words into Chinese characters in order to sort of preserve their foreignness, their flagging them as knowledge that's external to China.